So I'm Dr. Indrani from Department of Pathology. So today we'll discuss on DIC and vitamin K. So DIC stands for, any one of you knows what DIC? Yeah, please tell. Very good. So we'll talk about disseminated intravascular coagulation and vitamin K. So why vitamin K? Because among most of the vitamins, vitamin K is directly linked with coagulation factors, and for maintaining our normal hemostasis, vitamin K is very essential. So together with DIC, today we'll learn about vitamin K. So we'll discuss under these headings. So before moving into DIC, we will recapitulate regarding normal homeostasis. What is normal hemostasis? Then we'll have an introduction on DIC, pathogenesis, then what are the triggers that will increase the chances of DIC in a patient, and what will be the laboratory findings whenever you are in pathology. So how would you suspect DIC, how would you confirm DIC, okay, and then something about treatment. So I'm sure you have read sufficiently about hemostasis in your first professional MBBS in the physiology classes. So any one of you from this part, so tell me any component of hemostasis, any component that is required for maintaining hemostasis. So here are the picture is also there. Yes? Very good. So from this part you tell me any component of hemostasis. So for maintaining hemostasis, do we need coagulation factors or we don't? Yeah. So name some coagulation factors. Yes? Calcium, okay. Then any other? Any factor you remember? Factor, some factors in coagulation, factor 8, factor 9. Right, factor 10, okay. So you tell, except platelets and coagulation factors, any other protein or any other thing that is responsible for maintaining the hemostasis? Fibrinogen, very good. So basically fibrinogen is also one of the coagulation factors. So can you tell anything? Yes? Thromboxane A2, yes, that is also one of the component of coagulation system. So if we think that what are the major components of hemostasis, so normally blood is flowing in the blood vessels. Whenever there is any injury, our coagulation system will get activated to stop that bleeding. So for activation of coagulation, so some bada steps. First one is endothelial activation. So in the vascular endothelial, the vascular lining, there are many endothelial cells. So first they will contract, then they will secrete many mediators which will eventually activate the coagulation factors. So after that, in the final step, this fibrinogen to fibrin, this step is very essential for formation of the blood clot. Then in the human body physiology, you have must learn that suppose there is one vessel injury and bleeding is happening. After that, coagulation system was activated and there was formation of a blood clot. So this blood clot. So after formation of blood clot, there will always be a question that how will this clot dissolve? Otherwise, the patient will face clotting in his whole body, in all the blood vessels. So there must be one anti-thrombotic mechanism that will eventually lyse the clot and again bring our this coagulation system or hemostasis. It will again come into the fluidity. So natural anticoagulants or anti-thrombotic mechanisms are there, like protein C, protein S. So whenever there is formation of blood clot, usually next step is fibrinolysis. That clot will dissolve and blood will again move freely. So the same thing that we discussed now. Under normal condition, blood maintains its fluidity as it propelled through the circulatory system. However, in the event of an injury, clotting must occur to reduce loss of blood from the intravascular space. So this is body's mechanism to prevent the vessel injury, to prevent its progression. Hemostasis refers to the series of complex physiological processes that occur between the blood vessels. I talked about endothelial cells, endothelial lining. So that is blood vessels, then platelets. Platelets are also very important part of coagulation. So this is a physiological process that will happen between blood vessels, platelets, coagulation factors and other elements that promote the clotting and thereby prevent blood loss. So do you remember in the coagulation factors or coagulation system, you must have learned about intravascular and extravascular coagulation, right? So incitement of the coagulation cascade ultimately produces fibrin monomers that strengthen the initial platelet plug by spontaneously aggregating into end-to-end and side-to-side fibrils. Now clotting has happened, blood clot is there, so we are happy that now bleeding has stopped. But we will be more happy when the clot is also dissolved, so that blood is again flowing normally in the blood vessels. Now these clotting modalities are countered by a number of mitigating mechanisms that prevent excessive or inappropriate clotting. For example, activated coagulation factors are only effective for milliseconds or seconds before they are diluted by normal blood flow and cleared by the liver. Also, endogenous antithrombotic agents. You remember I told you protein C, protein S, then antithrombin. They are natural inhibitors of coagulation. Once any blood clot is formed, in a normal person, all these antithrombotic agents will get activated and they will help in lysis of the clot. So this is how the normal hemostatic balance is maintained. So there are procoagulant factors like tissue factor, clotting factors, then we can think of blood vessels, platelets. So these are procoagulant, they will activate the clotting, they will activate the formation of blood clot. And once the clot is formed, then this anticoagulant will come into action like protein C, protein S, fibrinolytic system, antithrombin 3. So basically to maintain the normal hemostasis, there must be a balance between procoagulant and anticoagulant factor. So whenever there is a imbalance, then the issue will start. Now that we have done a basic recapitulation of this coagulation system, how the normal hemostasis works in our body, we will move ahead with today's topic, that is today's topic, that is disseminated intravascular coagulation. So what can be the definition of DIC? So DIC is an acquired syndrome characterized by widespread activation of the coagulation cascade leading to microvascular thrombi that can cause organ dysfunction and consumption of clotting factors and platelets which will result in bleeding. And we must always remember this is secondary to any underlying disorder. So first line is it is an acquired syndrome. It is not primary, it is not genetic. So there will be something happening to the patient to increase the chances of developing DIC. And we need to understand the spectrum of DIC. So at one end, DIC can present with thrombosis. Microthrombi means small clots in all the major organs. At the other end of the spectrum, DIC can result in bleeding. Bleeding means life-threatening bleeding. So that's why it is very important to identify DIC as early as possible so that clinicians can start treatment and save the patient. Now I talked about there are many triggers of DIC. So it is an acquired condition, that means there will be some of the condition or some of the triggering factors that will increase the chances for the patient to develop DIC. The most common causes, pregnant females. So if we think of obstetric causes, placenta, you will start your, I'm sure you will start your clinics, no? You have started clinics in obstetrics and gynecology. So in pregnancy, placenta is a very important thing for maintenance of the pregnancy. So if there is a placental abruption or if there is amniotic fluid embolism, retained dead fetus or severe preeclampsia. So preeclampsia is a term that denotes whenever any pregnant female is having severe hypertension, proteinuria. So you will learn that in details in your gynae classes. So these are some of the obstetric causes that can really trigger DIC in a pregnant female. Then the next common cause is sepsis. So where do we accept to get these sepsis patients? So in hospital ICUs, right? So whenever someone is having severe sepsis, they will either get admitted in normal ward, or sometimes if it is too much sepsis, then they will shift the patient to ICU. That means ICU patients are also very much susceptible to develop DIC. So if we think of infections, gram-negative infection, gram-positive infection. So you must have learned in your microbiology classes the basic difference between gram-negative and gram-positive. So both sort of infections can give rise to DIC. The third triggering factor can be malignancy or cancers. So the first malignancy that is very much associated with DIC is acute promyelocytic leukemia. So sometimes you can get a MCQ also, that in which leukemia the chances of DIC is more. Let's say there will be Hodgkin lymphoma, acute myeloid leukemia, BALL, and acute promyelocytic leukemia. So the answer will be APML. You must not forget this one. Acute promyelocytic leukemia, there are release of some factors that really increase the chances of DIC. Then in solid malignancy also, metastatic adenocarcinoma. So this also increases the chances of DIC. If a patient gets admitted with major burn, crush injury, head injury, so in surgical ward, patients are also highly susceptible. Then as a part of transfusion reactions, patient can develop DIC. Snake bite, that is also very important. So in the emergency ward, we usually get patients, no? Patient will have a snake bite and they will, the family member, they will rush him to emergency. So those patients are also at a high risk for developing DIC. Now we'll discuss about pathogenesis mechanism or pathophysiology, whatever we can say, of DIC. So the first step in formation of DIC is the presence of any of those triggers. Of course, it can rarely happen in patients where we might not be finding any triggers, but in a patient who is already having one of the triggers, we should always open our mind and think whether he or she is developing DIC or not. So any of the underlying conditions that I discussed in previous two slides, they will cause release of massive procoagulants. So there are many procoagulants. Among them, the first factor that is inside the DIC is tissue factor. Tissue factor or tissue factor alites. Like you can say in acute promyelocytic leukemia, there are abnormal promyelocytes. So promyelocyte is basically one series of WBC cell. From promyelocyte, we see neutrophils in the peripheral blood. So those promyelocytes, they secrete tissue factor. Let's say in adenocarcinoma, there are some abnormal malignant cells. Those malignant cells will release tissue factor. In a pregnant woman, from the placental abruption or from the dead fetus, again procoagulant will get secreted. So this is the first step. So the first step is release of procoagulant, most common tissue factor. The release will happen in massive quantities. So once the tissue factor is released in a massive amount, next what will happen? It will basically activate the coagulation system. So tissue factor will activate extrinsic pathway first, then it will lead to the last step, that is thrombin generation. So any of you remember the extensive coagulation system? So it will start with some factor activation, then basically fibrinogen to fibrin, and then thrombin generation. So due to this massive thrombin explosion, there will be widespread fibrin deposition in microcirculation. So the hallmark is deposition of microthrombi. Microthrombi means small thrombi in the blood vessels. The blood vessels which are running in major organs like in kidneys, in brains, in lung, even in heart, in skins, everywhere. So deposition of microthrombi is the second step in formation of DIC. So I told you that at one end of the spectrum there will be thrombin and microthrombi. At another end of the spectrum there will be bleeding. So we are approaching from thrombi to bleeding. So once the coagulation system is activated, there will be one time when all the procoagulant factors will get utilized. Because whenever this coagulation system is activated and coagulation is happening, so it will consume all the factors, no? So all the platelets, all the fibrinogen, all the factor 8, factor 5, they will get consumed. So this will lead to consumptive coagulopathy. So next, whenever there are massive microthrombi in all the circulations, then our body will try to break down the excess fibrin. So once the excess fibrin is broken, so fibrin degradation products will increase and D-dimer, so one of the byproduct of fibrin degradation, that will also increase. Then there will be plasmin generation. So plasmin is one of the component of fibrinolysis. So that is important for lysis of the blood clot. So there is massive thrombin generation, massive microthrombi. So to combat that microthrombi, too much amount of plasmin will get released and there will be fibrinolysis. All those microthrombi, they will get lysed. So what will be the end organ effect? So in kidneys, DIC can present with AKI. AKI means acute kidney injury. In lungs, it might present as acute respiratory distress syndrome. In liver, it can present with liver failure. And in adrenal gland, if adrenal gland is affected, patient might present with shock. So this is basically what we talked about. Massive tissue destruction, or maybe due to sepsis or due to some endothelial injury, like in a snake bite case or in a burn patient, there will be endothelial injury. So all these triggers in any way or other way, they will release tissue factor, that is the procoagulant factor. Again, other procoagulant factors like platelets, they will also get aggregated. So the final result will be widespread microvascular thrombi. So after this widespread microvascular thrombi is generated, to combat the thrombi, this plasminogen system will get activated. So this will cause increased fibrinolysis. So fibrin split products, I told FTPs, D-dimers, they will get increased in our blood. And due to the microvascular thrombosis, it will cause vascular occlusion. So whenever so you try to think it like in a vessel, whenever there is too many small microthrombi, definitely the vessel will get narrowed, है ना? So whenever RBCs are passing through those narrowed vessels, those RBCs will get injured. So basically whenever any RBC is getting injured, we term it as hemolytic anemia because RBCs are getting destroyed. So these things will give rise to microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. Then at one point, after the coagulation system is activated, there will be consumption of all the clotting factors and platelets. So these will result in bleeding. So at one end, we have microvascular thrombosis. At another end of the spectrum, we have bleeding. So whenever we are suspecting any patient with DIC, we must keep in our mind that he or she can present with thrombosis, features of thrombosis as well as features of bleeding. So it depends at which stage we are seeing the patient. So these two terms I need all of you to remember. DIC is also known as consumptive coagulopathy. So sometimes there can be a short note or a MCQ also, that consumptive coagulopathy refers to which conditions. Options may be DIC, there may be liver failure or and so and so. So why consumptive coagulopathy? Because in DIC there is widespread activation of the coagulation system, widespread microvascular thrombosis. So to form that amount of thrombosis, all the coagulation factors, the platelets, the coagulation factors, they are getting used. So all the coagulation factors are getting consumed. That's why it is also known as consumptive coagulopathy. Another is microangiopathic hemolytic anemia that I told you. So due to formation of microthrombi in the vascular channels of our body, whenever the RBCs are passing through those narrowed microvasculature, those RBCs will get injured. So whenever any injured RBC or defective RBC is there, our body's mechanism is to remove that RBC. So RBC destruction means hemolytic anemia. Because the hemolytic anemia is due to destruction of the RBCs inside the vessels, that's why it is termed as microangiopathic hemolytic anemia, or we tell it as MAHA. Now types of DIC. So it can be acute or it can be chronic. So anything acute, we understand that it happens very fast, maybe within days or within hours. So by chance if there is a dead fetus or placental abruption, these are always emergency for a pregnant lady. So in that scenario, it will present as acute DIC. Then talking about chronic DICs, it can happen in a malignancy. So malignancy might be present for a bit of longer period of time, maybe for months, before detection of the malignancy. So that scenario can present like chronic DIC. So in acute DIC, patient generally presents with more bleeding spectrum. And in chronic DIC, patient generally present more with thrombotic spectrum. Now, clinical features, I told you, we should see the patient with an open mind, whether we are seeing him on a bleeding spectrum or thrombosis spectrum. So, if presentation in bleeding spectrum, then they can have petechiae and ecchymosis, oozing from sides in the venipuncture side or urinary catheter side. There might be bleeding from these sides. Hematuria. What is hematuria? Blood in urine, very good. Postpartum hemorrhage, okay. So if the patient presents with thrombosis, then we can suspect digital ischemia. So digital ischemia means in the fingertips, the patient will present pain because there are small vessels in our fingertips, they will have microthrombi. So they can present with digital ischemia. Renal failure. So renal failure can happen if in the renal arteries there are microvascular formation, thrombi formation. So the kidney is not getting the amount of blood that it deserves. So renal failure can also happen. Lung injury can happen if there are thrombi, fibrin thrombi in blood vessels that involve the lung. Deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, even stroke can happen. And shock and organ failure will happen in severe forms. So you know about MODS, MODS, we have learned, multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. So in a case where DIC is not treated and it is going on for days, so the final outcome will be multi-organ dysfunction syndrome. Now, what can be the laboratory investigation that will help us to suspect? So one, we will suspect clinically. Then if we know that patient is having some of the triggering factors, so our first differential diagnosis will come in mind, that DIC. But it should be supported by laboratory investigations also. So the first investigation, the basic investigation is complete blood count. So what will happen in complete blood count? So platelet was one of the coagulation factor. So I told consumptive coagulopathy. So in the early stages, platelet will be slightly low, like maybe less than 1 lakh. But as the DIC is progressing and the patient is going towards consumptive coagulopathy, that means all his platelets are getting consumed. So the platelet count will be low, isn't it? And hemoglobin will also be reduced if the patient is having bleeding. So any bleeding will reduce the amount of hemoglobin. So what is this vial? Any idea? What vial is this? Huh? EDTA, very good. So EDTA vial is needed for CBC. Any other investigation you remember that we can do with EDTA vial? So after CBC, which investigation we think? If we need to see the slide, it is peripheral blood smear. So for peripheral blood smear also, same vial, EDTA vial. So what will happen in peripheral blood smear? We will see cystocytes. So these cystocytes are basically marker of MAHA that I told you, microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. I told you that when the RBCs, they pass through those deranged vessels, the vessels with microthrombi, then they will get injured. So what happens in a... So these are the normal RBCs, right? So here they are appearing as totally round, but actually whenever we learn about RBC, they are biconcave shape, isn't it? All the borders are intact, but you see these things, these are also RBCs. But these are fragmented RBCs, or we tell them as cystocytes, because the RBC got injured when it was traveling through those blood vessels which have been affected by microthrombi. Okay, so there are microthrombi or fibrin depositions inside the blood vessels. So the normal RBC, when it was passing through that blood vessels, they got injured. See, many are there. So usually we won't see that many. If we are seeing that many cystocytes, that means it is very severe DIC, very severe form of DIC. In CBC findings, we have seen PBF findings at what time we will suspect DIC. Now the major investigation, that is from coagulation system. So these are PT and APTT. So I am sure you know this from your physiology classes. PT is prothrombin time, that usually tells us about how the extrinsic pathway of coagulation is working, how the common pathways of coagulation is working. And APTT, A ulta, this defines about the intrinsic pathway of coagulation and the common pathway of coagulation. So there are again consumption of all the coagulation factors also. So factor 7, that is mainly involved in extrinsic pathway, and factor 5 and 10 in which pathway? Factor 5 and 10, any of you remembers whether it is extrinsic or intrinsic? Huh? Yes? So factor 5 and factor 10, common pathway, right? Common pathway. Factor 7 is extrinsic pathway. So because there are consumption of factor 7, factor 5, factor 10, the PT will increase. Similarly for APTT also, factor 5, 8, 11, 12, all these factors are, except 5, these 8, 11 and 12, these are involved in intrinsic pathway of coagulation, and factor 5 and 10 we know that this is in combined pathway. So all these coagulation factors will also get consumed. That's why PT, the prothrombin time, and APTT, the activated partial thromboplastin time, will get elevated. They will be increased. What are these vials? Citrate vials. So any idea what will be the percentage of citrate vial that we will use to collect the samples for PT and APTT? So it is 3.2%. So next time whenever you are going to lab, you check one citrate vial and see the percentage of trisodium citrate. Okay, so it is usually 3.2%. So it will definitely be asked in your vivas, the percentage. Then there is thrombin time. This thrombin time is also prolonged. It is due to low fibrinogen and high FDPs. I told because there are too much fibrin generation, then our body will start to lyse the fibrin. So there will be increase in the production of FDP, that is fibrin degradation products, and D-dimer. So all these increased numbers of FDP, they will increase the PT. That is the thrombin time is also increased in DIC along with PT and APTT. So what will happen to fibrinogen levels? So you told us that fibrinogen is one part of coagulation system. So like other coagulation factors, this fibrinogen will also get consumed. So fibrinogen will become low in DIC. And FDPs, they will get increased due to increased breakdown of fibrin and fibrinogen will get high FDPs in a patient of DIC. It is not non-specific but supportive of DIC. D-dimer level will also be markedly increased, and this D-dimer, it is highly sensitive for DIC. So the two tests that are most sensitive and specific for DIC are FDP, fibrinogen degradation products, and D-dimer. Very high levels are characteristic of acute DIC. So once we see a patient of DIC, so the treatment should be very fast. We should initiate the treatment very fast, otherwise we are going to lose the patient. So the golden rule is to treat the underlying cause. So in the first slide, if you remember, I have told DIC is an acquired condition. That means there is something else going in the patient body, some other primary event is going on that is triggering the formation of DIC. So in the management, the first step will be treat the primary cause. If they are having any malignancy, try to treat the malignancy. If there is any obstetric complications, like there is a dead fetus, you remove the dead fetus. So the golden rule is to treat the underlying cause as early as possible. Then if bleeding is the predominating factor in any patient, then we'll give FFP, fresh frozen plasmas, platelets or cryoprecipitates. So all these products, these are basically blood products. So from the blood, we'll get cryoprecipitate, we'll get fresh frozen plasma. And if thrombosis predominates, then we start with low dose heparin. So low dose heparin is mostly used in chronic DIC that I discussed, that malignancy associated DIC. The chronic one that will most likely present with thrombosis rather than bleeding. So in that case, low dose heparin is important to eliminate those small thrombi. And in others, so we have to maintain the patient for blood pressure. If there is acidosis, we have to correct that acidosis, correct the hypoxia, hypothermia, all these things. Now coming to organ morphology in DIC. So when I say organ morphology, these are postpartum findings. So in a living patient, we cannot do this biopsy, no, because already this is a life-threatening bleeding is there, so there will be chances of bleeding. So whenever we discuss about organ morphology, that means in a patient who has died, so after that we are seeing that organ, the post-mortem pathology. So in DIC, microthrombi are most often found in arterioles and capillaries of the kidneys, adrenal glands, brain and heart. So these are the most common organs, but we must remember that no organ is spared because there is widespread microvascular thrombosis. In all the organs, you will get small thrombi. Among them, the most common organs are kidneys, adrenals, brains. So what will happen to kidney? So you have not started with kidney classes yet. So, but you must be having some idea from your physiology classes, and in anatomy, histology also, you know, in the kidney section, we'll see glomeruli, we'll see tubules, right? Proximal convoluted tubules, distal convoluted tubules. So what will happen to those organs? So in kidneys, the glomeruli will contain small fibrin thrombi. This may be associated with only a subtle reactive swelling of the endothelial cells or varying degrees of focal glomerulitis. In severe cases, the ischemia can destroy the entire cortex and cause bilateral renal cortical necrosis. And involve kidney, just above the kidney there will be adrenal glands, that is also known as suprarenal glands, you might be remembering. So together with kidney, when the adrenal glands are also involved, then there is one syndrome, that is Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome. So these might you can get in single liner or MCQs, that Waterhouse-Friderichsen syndrome is also a DIC which has involved the kidneys along with the adrenal glands. So this is the kidney glomeruli. So you see all these pink things, these are microvascular, these are the thrombi generation, the fibrins, thrombins and fibrins, these things. So PTAH is phosphotungstic acid hematoxylin. So this is an immunohistochemical marker that is used for fibrins and muscles. So here we can see, it is highlighted, right? You see the tubules are not highlighted. Here highlighted blue things, no? All these are fibrils that has been highlighted by this IHC, PTAH, phosphotactic acid hematoxylate. Now, the major organ involved is kidney, but other organs can also get involved. So, microinfarcts also are commonly encountered in brain and are often surrounded by microscopic or gross foci of hemorrhages. These can give rise to bizarre neurological signs. Similar changes are seen in heart and often in anterior pituitary, and DIC may contribute to development of Sheehan postpartum pituitary necrosis. So pituitary is one endocrine gland that you know. So in a pregnant lady after delivery, it can present with pituitary necrosis also. Okay, so we have finished DIC. So any question on DIC? So the major things we must remember, this is an intravascular coagulation because there is widespread fibrin deposition, widespread activation of the coagulation system. So there is microvascular injury. So after the coagulation system is activated, next the fibrinolysis will get activated. That will consume all the coagulation factors, and at one spectrum it will present with thrombosis, and the another spectrum of the disease it will present with bleeding. But it is a life-threatening situation, so we must think of DIC as a differential diagnosis. In the laboratory findings, the most important coagulation findings will be increased prothrombin time, increased activated partial thromboplastin time, low fibrinogen, high FDPs, high D dimers, and we'll get low platelets, and if the patient is presenting in a bleeding scenario, then eventually the hemoglobin will drop. And we must remember some of the triggers of DIC also. If any short loads are coming, the first trigger we must remember the obstetric cause. Next is cancer associated. Next, in ICU patients, the gram-negative, gram-positive infections, they will trigger the DIC. Okay. So next, the second half, that is vitamin K. This is not as vast as DIC. Okay. So vitamin K is basically one sort of vitamin. This is a fat soluble vitamin. So another one is what soluble? Water soluble. Very good. So this vitamin is essential for blood coagulation and for bone metabolism. There are three types. So the K1, the source is usually green leafy vegetables. And the second type, that is vitamin K2, it is synthesized in our body itself by the gut bacteria. And K3 is synthetic form, but nowadays it is no longer used because in the studies it has been found that it has some toxicities. So we are not using vitamin K3 these days. So K1 we will get from our dietary sources, and K2 will basically our gut bacteria will produce. So some lines on absorption, how the vitamin K is absorbed in our body, how it is transported, and how it is eventually metabolized and excreted from our body. So for absorption, it requires bile salts and pancreatic lipase. And where it is absorbed most? It is absorbed mostly in proximal small intestine. So the organ in proximal small intestine will be which one? Ileum or which one? Duodenum. Very good. So proximal small intestine is the place where most of the vitamin K will get absorbed, and patient requires a healthy pancreas, and healthy common bile duct to ensure the most absorption of vitamin K, because we need bile salts and pancreatic lipase for absorption of vitamin K. Why do we need bile salts? Because in the bile salt we will get chylomicrons. So it is for transport the vitamin K after absorption, it is packed into chylomicrons, and through the lymphatics it enters into the bloodstream. Stored in liver, however, it is in very small amount. So if our storage is not that much, then we will need continuous inflow of vitamin K to maintain the normal levels. So the dietary source is very important. Otherwise the patient will develop deficiency of vitamin K if intake or absorption is poor, because the amount that is stored in liver is very minimal for vitamin K. So all of you should have a good chunk of green leafy vegetables in your diet to maintain the vitamin K. So for metabolism and recycling, vitamin K acts as a cofactor for gamma glutamyl carboxylase. Then it becomes oxidized and must be recycled by this enzyme. So this enzyme is very important whenever we are talking about vitamin K. That is vitamin K epoxide reductase, or shortly it is termed as VCOR. Okay, vitamin K epoxide reductase. So there is one medicine, warfarin. This is again a life-saving medicine actually. This is an anticoagulant medicine. So this drug, it inhibits this enzyme, this vitamin K epoxide reductase. So it will cause functional deficiency of vitamin K in a patient. So any patient who is having warfarin, they are susceptible to develop vitamin K deficiency, because this enzyme, which is responsible for recycling vitamin K in our body, will get inhibited by the drug warfarin. So here, so in the green leafy vegetables, we'll get vitamin K, the K1, and from the gut bacteria, we'll get the type 2 vitamin, that is vitamin K2. And then with the help of bile salts and with the help of pancreatic lipase, it will get absorbed into the bloodstream. Then chylomicrons, they will take this vitamin K into the liver. This is in the blood vessels. So from blood vessels, it will go into the liver. So in the liver, the most important function of vitamin K will take place. So in a single line, if all of you should remember vitamin K is, it helps in gamma carboxylation of the clotting factors. Which clotting factors? Vitamin K dependent clotting factors. What are those? Here, see. The procoagulant factors, factor 2, 7, 9, 10. You need to mug up these 4 coagulation factors. So sometimes MCQs can come, or I might ask again that 2, 7, 9 and 11. Among these, which coagulation factor will not require vitamin K? So the answer will be 11. Because 2, 7, 9, 10, these 4 coagulation factors, vitamin K is needed for gamma carboxylation. Similarly, like coagulation factor, this anticoagulant, antithrombotic things, protein C, protein S, for this also vitamin K is needed. So you see, vitamin K is one such vitamin that is important to maintain coagulation, again important to maintain anticoagulation also. So this kind of adding to the balance in our normal hemostasis. So in the liver, I told that it will be stored in very less amount. For excretion, it will get excreted in kidneys. And some of the vitamin K from liver, they will get recycled into peripheral tissues like in the heart, in the brain and in the bone also. So for maintaining a good bone health, for maintaining a good cardiac health also, some of the vitamin Ks are needed. However, the major function, whenever anyone is asking or you are trying to remember, is the first action is gamma carboxylation of clotting factors. For procoagulant, factor 2, 7, 9, 10. For anticoagulant, protein C, protein S and protein Z. So vitamin K is very important for maintaining our normal hemostasis. Functions of vitamin K. The main function is coagulation. It is required for gamma carboxylation of factor 2, 7, 9, 10. Then for natural anticoagulants also protein C and protein S. So after the gamma carboxylation only, the clotting factors are activated. They can incorporate with calcium and they can take part in our coagulation system, activating the coagulation system. So when I say about 2, 7, 9, 10, you see, if you think 7 is important for which pathway, extrinsic or intrinsic? Extrinsic. So 7 is important for extrinsic pathway, 9 is primarily responsible for intrinsic pathway, isn't it? And 2 and 10 are common pathway. So we can say safely that vitamin K important for extrinsic pathway as well as for intrinsic pathway as well as for common pathway. And protein C and protein S are natural anticoagulant. So it is also responsible for normal anticoagulation of the body. Then I told about bone metabolism. So this is also needed for gamma carboxylation of osteocalcin. So osteocalcin is a protein that is basically needed to maintain bone health. And if the patient or person is having inadequate vitamin K, so there will be decreased bone mineralization. So the bone health will also deteriorate. And for vascular health also, so if one person is having sufficient vitamin K, then this vitamin K will inhibit vascular calcification. So if there is vascular calcification, then there is chances that eventually the person will develop vessel thrombosis, because whenever there is increased calcium, it will again try to activate the coagulation system, so there might be again small thrombosis. So dietary sources, I have already told: green leafy vegetables, vegetable oils, meat, liver, even fermented foods also, there will be some vitamin K. So daily requirement for adults 90 to 120 microgram per day. For newborns, they are actually susceptible for vitamin K deficiency. So it is multifactorial actually. One, there is very less placental transfer from mother to the fetus. So they don't receive any vitamin K from the mother. Then after birth, in breastfeed also, in the breast milk also, there is less vitamin K. Then for a newborn, their gut health is also not that mature to, the gut bacteria can also not synthesize vitamin K. So there might be a short note that why neonates have increased susceptibility to vitamin K deficiency. So these are some of the cases: very less placental transfer, then inadequate or immature gut health to produce vitamin K. Even the breast milk have very less amounts of vitamin K. So whenever in a newborn there is less vitamin K, they are increased susceptible to hemorrhagic disease of the newborn. So in the absence of vitamin K, the coagulation factors cannot get activated. So there is always chances of hemorrhage. So in the newborn baby, if the pediatrician is suspecting hemorrhagic disease of newborn, they will give prophylactic vitamin K injections to the newborn baby. You might be seeing in your pediatric clinical postings. So what can be the causes of vitamin K deficiency? So the first cause can be poor intake. If someone is not eating good enough vitamin K, so for malnutrition, or sometimes in old age patient or in elderly patient who are chronic alcoholics, so they will not eat, or even if they eat, it will not get absorbed. So in the case of malabsorption, like in chronic diarrhea patient, in celiac disease, or in some patients who needed intestinal resection, so their part of their duodenum is already removed from the body, then where will that vitamin K get absorbed? So in malabsorption also, it can result in vitamin K deficiency. Then some drugs. So in the drugs, if you need to remember one drug, remember warfarin. So warfarin, I told you, is an anticoagulant drug. You will learn about warfarin in your pharmacology classes. It is a very life-saving drug, anticoagulant drug, but then it comes with a side effect that vitamin K epoxide reductase, the main enzyme responsible for recycling of vitamin K, the warfarin drug will inhibit that enzyme. And some broad spectrum antibiotics also. So the antibiotic will kill the gut flora, which is important for recycling of the vitamin K. So in the newborns, I have told, that is also very important for the neonatologist or the pediatrician. They are also very susceptible to have reduced vitamin K, and the baby might present with hemorrhagic disease of newborn. And to prevent that one, the pediatrician, they prefer giving prophylactic vitamin K injections to the newborn. The clinical features, they will present with bleeding manifestations. They can present with gum bleeding, epistaxis, GI bleed, hematuria, or in the newborn they can present with bleeding in the CNS also. So that is a life-threatening bleeding. Excessive bleeding after minor trauma or intramuscular injections or any surgery. So laboratory investigations in vitamin K deficiency. Again, the PT is the earliest marker to get prolonged. Why? Because I told you what are the 4 coagulation factors where for gamma carboxylation we need vitamin K, that is 2, 7, 9 and 10. So 7 is primarily responsible for the extrinsic pathway. So whenever there is any defect in extrinsic pathway, the PT will get prolonged. That is prothrombin time. That similarly, the APTT will also get prolonged because factor 9 and 10 are also there, no, in the gamma carboxylation. So basically, both PT and APTT will be increased, and the platelet count will be normal. It will not be affected. So by chance, if we have any doubt from a bleeding that whether the patient is having DIC or the patient is having vitamin K deficiency, then one or two things that can differentiate is platelet. The platelet count will be reduced because that was consumptive coagulopathy. The platelet count will be reduced in DIC, but in vitamin K deficiency it will be normal. Fibrinogen will be reduced in DIC, but in vitamin K deficiency it will be normal. The FDPs and D dimers will be what in DIC? Huh? Remember? Increased. Very good. So the FDPs and D dimers will be increased in DIC, but in vitamin K deficiency they will be unchanged because there is no increased fibrinolysis happening. Just the coagulation is not happening because of this factor 2, 7, 9 and 10. Okay. So for treatment, if we suspect vitamin K deficiency and we are seeing the laboratory patterns that are matching with the vitamin K deficiency, then we'll give vitamin K supplement. So we can give it orally or intramuscular or intravenous. If the patient is presenting with severe bleeding, then for immediate factor replacement, we can give fresh frozen plasma. And sometimes I told about warfarin. So sometimes patient might present with warfarin overdose. So warfarin overdose means vitamin K is very less because in normal dose itself warfarin will reduce vitamin K levels, and whenever it is overdose then it will be very low vitamin K. That time we should give vitamin K injections as well as fresh frozen plasma. For very high INR will be high in a patient who has received warfarin overdose. So INR high patients or any patient with major bleeding, there is another blood product that is prothrombin complex concentrate. So in that factor 2, 5, 2, 7, 9 and 10 or more. So that blood product can also be given. So now we come to the end of vitamin K also. So for vitamin K, some points that we must remember is it is a fat soluble vitamin. The most important function is gamma carboxylation of coagulation factors as well as of natural inhibitors of coagulation. So among coagulation factors it is 2, 7, 9, 10, and among natural inhibitors of coagulation it is protein C and protein S. So whenever there is vitamin K deficiency, the coagulation, extrinsic coagulation will not occur, intrinsic coagulation will not occur. So in the laboratory findings, we will get prolonged prothrombin time, we will get prolonged activated partial thromboplastin time. However, the platelet count will be normal. That will help us in differentiating this condition from DIC. And who are most susceptible? Those who are suffering from malnutrition or any chronic, very ill patients, any patients who has had intestinal resections where the absorption is not happening, or in neonates. These people are, there are more chances that they will eventually get vitamin K deficiency. So if we diagnose it, we need to supplement the vitamin K from outside. We can give it orally or intramuscular or intravenous. But in situations where there are life-threatening bleeding, then we need to give some blood products like fresh frozen plasma or prothrombin complex concentrate. Okay? Any question? So what was the cited vial percentage for coagulation tests? 3.2%. Very good. And what is consumptive coagulopathy? Which condition is known as consumptive coagulopathy? DIC. Another name for DIC. Then what is the full form of MAHA? Microangiopathic hemolytic anemia. So that is also a hallmark for DIC, because in those blood vessels where there are thrombin fibrin generation, whenever the RBCs are passing through those vessels, so the RBCs will get injured. So I showed the shape of RBC. It is quite different from a normal RBCs. The surface are broken, they are sharpened. So what is the name of that cell? That is cystocytes. That is also a good marker. When you see in a PBF cystocytes, so we must first suspect MAHA or DIC. Okay, and the base tests for DIC, it might be increased D dimer or increased FDPs. Okay, so you try to revise these two topics today itself in the evening, so that there are more chances that you will retain the class a bit. Okay, all the best.